My life has always been about structure, predictability, and making sure that everything around me stayed in perfect order. That's the kind of man I am, someone who takes care of the details, who notices the little things. I'm the guy who always remembers to pick up the milk, even when no one asks. I'm the guy who knows when the car is due for an oil change just by the sound of the engine. And I'm the guy who's always been loyal to my wife, Rebecca. We've been married for 15 years now. No kids. Just the two of us, living in this comfortable suburban home we've built together. It wasn't always perfect, what marriage is, but we had something solid. Or at least, that's what I thought. Lately, though, something's been off. At first, it was just a feeling, a slight unease that gnawed at the back of my mind. I shrugged it off, telling myself that it was just stress from work, or maybe the fact that we've both been so busy lately. Rebecca's been working late more often, something about new projects at her job. I didn't think much of it at first. We all have deadlines, and she's always been committed to her career. But it wasn't just the late nights. It was her attitude that started to shift, small things, like how she'd brush off my questions or snap at me for no reason. She started spending more time on her phone, too, always quick to lock the screen whenever I walked by. Then there were the business trips. They started to come more frequently, and something about them just didn't sit right with me. I mean, Rebecca's job isn't the kind that typically requires a lot of travel. But every couple of weeks, she'd be off to another city for a conference or client meeting. I started to wonder if maybe it was me, if maybe I was doing something wrong. So, I made an extra effort to be supportive. I'd make dinner for when she got home late, try to lighten her load around the house, but nothing seemed to make a difference. I remember one night last month when I tried to talk to her about it. She had just come home from one of those trips, and I could see the tension in her face. I asked her if everything was okay, if there was something we needed to talk about. She looked at me like I'd grown a second head, brushed past me, and went straight to the shower without saying a word. Later, she said she was just tired, that the trip had worn her out. But the way she avoided my eyes when she said it made me feel like there was something more. I didn't press her on it, but that unease, that gnawing feeling, it grew stronger. It was around that time that I started noticing the little things. A change in her perfume that she'd never mentioned. A new dress she hadn't shown me. A strange receipt in the trash from a restaurant we'd never been to. I'm a detail-oriented guy, so these things stuck with me. I tried to ignore them, to push them to the back of my mind, but they kept piling up. I didn't want to believe that there was anything wrong, didn't want to believe that maybe Rebecca was pulling away from me. And then there were the calls. She'd step out of the room to take them, speaking in hushed tones, sometimes late at night. When I'd ask who it was, she'd give me vague answers, saying it was just a friend or someone from work. But the tone of those conversations didn't sound like work. They sounded like something else, something that wasn't meant for my ears. I started to feel like a stranger in my own home, like there was this invisible wall growing between us that I couldn't break down. I wanted to believe that it was just my imagination, that I was overthinking things. But the signs were all there, staring me in the face. Finally, one night, I couldn't take it anymore. I waited until she was asleep and picked up her phone, hands shaking as I navigated to her messages. I wasn't even sure what I was looking for. Maybe I was hoping to find something innocent, something that would put my mind at ease. But what I found instead was a series of texts from a number saved under a name I didn't recognize, a name that made my stomach churn. The messages were flirtatious, intimate, and sickeningly familiar. They talked about things they had done, things they planned to do. There was mention of a hotel, of a weekend they'd spent together while she was supposedly out of town on business. My heart pounded in my chest as I scrolled through the messages, each one a stab to my gut. I put the phone down and stared at the ceiling, feeling the walls of my world closing in on me. It was like everything I thought I knew, everything I believed about my life, was crumbling right in front of me. I didn't sleep at all that night. I just lay there, next to Rebecca, feeling a mix of anger, confusion, and despair. How could she do this? How could she betray me like this? In the morning, I went through the motions, got up, made coffee, kissed her goodbye as she left for work. But inside, I was shattered. I knew what I had to do. I had to find out the truth, no matter how much it hurt. I needed to know who this other man was, what he had that I didn't. And most importantly, I needed to figure out what the hell I was going to do about it. I'm not sure how things got to this point, how our lives veered so far off course. But I'm going to get to the bottom of it, even if it destroys everything in the process. Because at this point, I need answers more than I need to hold on to the lie that our marriage has become. The day after I discovered those messages, I could barely keep it together. At work, I was a mess, distracted, jittery, and unable to focus on anything. My mind kept replaying the texts over and over, each word fueling the fire of betrayal burning inside me. I knew I had to do something, but I wasn't sure where to start. That night, after Rebecca fell asleep, I decided to dig deeper. I needed proof, something tangible that would confirm what I already knew in my gut. The next morning, after she left for work, I called in sick. My boss wasn't thrilled, but I couldn't care less at that point. I spent the day planning my next move, trying to figure out how to catch her in the act. I didn't just want to accuse her based on some texts, I wanted something undeniable, something she couldn't talk her way out of. I thought about hiring a private investigator, but the idea of someone else handling my business didn't sit right with me. This was my marriage, my life, I needed to do this myself. So, I decided to follow her. I knew her routine well enough, I knew where she worked, where she liked to go after work, and I even had a rough idea of when she might meet this guy. All I needed was patience and a little bit of luck. That evening, I parked a few blocks away from her office, where I had a clear view of the entrance. I felt ridiculous sitting there in my car, hiding like some kind of amateur detective, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this was the only way to get the truth. I watched as she left the building, dressed in that new dress I'd noticed in the closet a few weeks ago. She looked good, too good. It made my blood boil just thinking about who she was dressing up for. She walked down the street, checking her phone every few steps, and I followed at a safe distance. My heart pounded as I kept my eyes on her, my hands gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. I trailed her to a bar on the other side of town, a place we'd never been to together. She walked inside without hesitation, like she knew exactly where she was going. I waited in the car, my nerves on edge. After about 20 minutes, I saw him. The guy from the texts. He was younger, dressed sharp, and had this cocky swagger about him that made me want to knock his teeth out. He walked into the bar, and I knew it was only a matter of time before I got what I came for. I grabbed my phone and stepped out of the car, my heart pounding in my ears. I wasn't sure what I was about to see, but I knew I needed to be ready. I approached the bar cautiously, keeping to the shadows as I peered through the window. And there they were, sitting in a booth at the back, their heads close together, laughing, and talking like they didn't have a care in the world. I snapped a few photos with my phone, my hands trembling as I captured them together. Then, as if the universe wanted to confirm my worst fears, they kissed. Right there in front of everyone, Rebecca leaned in and kissed him, slow and intimate, like they were the only two people in the room. My stomach churned, and for a moment, I thought I might throw up. But instead of retreating, I kept taking pictures, documenting every second of their betrayal. When they finally pulled apart, I forced myself to step away from the window before I did something I'd regret. My vision blurred with rage, and I knew I needed to calm down before confronting them. This wasn't the time or place. I needed to bide my time and catch them where they couldn't run, where they couldn't hide behind excuses or lies. I went back to my car and waited. An hour later, they emerged from the bar, arms wrapped around each other, oblivious to the world around them. They walked down the street, laughing and talking, and I followed them, my blood boiling with every step they took. They stopped outside a hotel, one of those sleazy places that rent by the hour, and I watched as he leaned in and kissed her again. That was it for me. I'd seen enough. I parked a short distance away and waited. The street was quiet, and the only sound was the occasional car passing by. I saw him exit the hotel about an hour later, walking down the street like he didn't have a care in the world. He was alone now, and my anger surged as I realized this was my chance. I stepped out of the car, heart pounding, adrenaline pumping through my veins. I walked towards him, fists clenched, trying to keep my cool, but every step closer made it harder. As I got near, he turned and saw me, but it was too late for him to react. Without thinking, I lunged at him, landing a solid punch to his jaw. The impact sent him stumbling back, his eyes wide with shock. "What the fuck?" he shouted, trying to regain his balance, but I wasn't done. Not by a long shot. "That's for fucking my wife," I snarled, landing another punch, this time to his gut. He doubled over, gasping for air, but I didn't let up. I grabbed him by the collar and slammed him against the wall, my face inches from his. "You think you can just screw around with someone's wife and get away with it?" I growled, my voice low and dangerous. He tried to stammer out some kind of apology, but I wasn't interested in hearing it. I wanted him to feel the pain he'd caused me, to understand what it meant to mess with another man's life. I hit him again, harder this time, and he crumpled to the ground, moaning in pain. I stood over him, breathing heavily, my knuckles throbbing from the impact. For a brief moment, I considered kicking him while he was down, finishing what I'd started. But then I thought of Rebecca, and the realization of what I'd done hit me like a ton of bricks. This wasn't who I was. I wasn't a violent man, and I'd let my anger drive me to a place I never wanted to go. I stepped back, staring down at him, disgusted with myself and with the whole situation. "Stay the hell away from my wife," I spat, before turning on my heel and walking away, leaving him groaning on the pavement. I didn't look back. I couldn't. All I wanted now was to get as far away from there as possible, to put some distance between me and the mess my life had become. I got into my car and drove, my hands shaking, my mind racing with everything that had just happened. I knew I couldn't keep this a secret. I had to confront Rebecca, had to face what was coming next. But right now, I needed time to think, time to figure out what the hell I was going to do with the shattered pieces of my life. As I drove through the darkened streets, I realized there was no going back. I'd crossed a line tonight, and nothing would ever be the same again. After leaving him there on the street, I drove around aimlessly for what felt like hours, trying to get a grip on my emotions. The adrenaline from the fight was still pumping through my veins, making it hard to think straight. My knuckles throbbed, and my mind was a whirlwind of anger, betrayal, and confusion. But one thing was crystal clear: I needed to confront Rebecca. No more sneaking around, no more playing the fool. I was going to get answers, and I was going to get them tonight. I pulled up to our house, my heart pounding in my chest as I killed the engine. The house was dark, and for a moment, I sat there in the silence, trying to calm the storm inside me. I knew what I was about to do could go one of two ways: either it would tear everything apart, or it would force us to face the ugly truth and figure out where we stood. But either way, I was done being in the dark. I got out of the car and walked up the driveway, the night air cool against my skin. I could see a faint light in the living room, and I knew she was home. The thought of her sitting there, maybe texting that piece of shit or thinking about their little rendezvous, made my blood boil all over again. But I forced myself to stay calm. I couldn't lose it, not yet. I unlocked the door and stepped inside, shutting it behind me with a sense of finality. The sound echoed through the empty hallway, and I could feel the tension in the air. Rebecca was on the couch, her phone in hand, but when she saw me, she quickly put it down, a nervous smile playing on her lips. "Hey," she said, trying to sound casual. "You're home late. Everything okay?" Her voice, that same voice I'd listened to for 15 years, sounded so fake now, so distant. I didn't respond immediately. I just stood there, staring at her, feeling the weight of the night pressing down on me. "Yeah," I finally said, my voice low and controlled. "Everything's just fine, Rebecca. We need to talk." She must have sensed something in my tone because her smile faltered, and she shifted uncomfortably on the couch. "What's going on?" she asked, her eyes darting around the room, avoiding mine. "I know," I said simply, watching her reaction closely. Her eyes snapped back to mine, and for a split second, I saw panic flash across her face before she quickly masked it with confusion. "You know what? Don't play dumb with me," I growled, my control slipping just a bit. "I know about him. I know about you sneaking around, fucking some other guy while I've been working my ass off to make this life for us." She blinked, and for a moment, I thought she was going to deny it, to try and weasel her way out of it. But then something inside her seemed to snap. Her face twisted into something ugly, and she stood up, crossing her arms over her chest in a defensive stance. "So what if I am?" she shot back, her voice sharp and defiant. "You think you can just come home and throw accusations at me? Maybe if you weren't so fucking boring, I wouldn't have had to find someone else." Her words hit me like a slap in the face, but instead of backing down, they fueled the fire that was already burning inside me. "Boring? You think this is about me being boring? You've been lying to my face, sneaking around, cheating on me, and you're going to stand there and try to blame me?" Rebecca's eyes flashed with anger, and she took a step closer, her voice rising. "Maybe if you weren't always so focused on your damn job, you'd have noticed that I was miserable. I needed more than what you were giving me, but you were too busy playing the perfect husband to see that." "Bullshit," I spat, stepping right into her space. "I gave you everything, everything you could ever want or need, and this is how you repay me? By spreading your legs for some asshole behind my back?" She recoiled at that, her face flushing with anger. "Don't you dare talk to me like that. You think you're so perfect, but you're not. You never really cared about what I wanted, what I needed. All you cared about was making sure everything looked perfect on the outside." "That's not true, and you know it," I shot back. "I loved you. I trusted you. But I guess that wasn't enough, was it? You had to go and fuck everything up because you're a selfish, ungrateful bitch." Her eyes narrowed, and for a moment, I thought she might slap me. But instead, she sneered, her lip curling in disdain. "You want to talk about being selfish? What about you, huh? You're so wrapped up in your own little world, in your stupid job, that you didn't even notice when I started pulling away. You didn't care that I was unhappy, that I was lonely. You just kept doing your thing, pretending everything was fine, because that's all you know how to do, pretend." I stared at her, my chest heaving with anger and frustration. How had it come to this? How had we gone from being a team, from loving and supporting each other, to tearing each other apart like this? "What the hell happened to us, Rebecca?" I asked, my voice rough with emotion. "How did we get here?" She looked away, her arms dropping to her sides as she took a deep breath. For a moment, she seemed to deflate, the fight draining out of her. "I don't know," she whispered. "I don't know when it all went wrong. But it did, and now here we are." I wanted to scream at her, to shake her, to make her understand how much she'd hurt me, how much she'd destroyed. But looking at her now, at the defeated expression on her face, I realized that she was as lost as I was. She'd made her choices, terrible, selfish choices, but maybe, just maybe, this wasn't something that had started with her betrayal. Maybe it had started long before, with the cracks in our relationship that we both ignored, hoping they would somehow fix themselves. But that didn't make what she did right. It didn't make it any easier to forgive. And as much as I wanted to believe that we could somehow fix this, that we could find our way back to what we used to be, I knew in my gut that it wasn't that simple. "So, what now?" I asked, the weight of the question hanging between us. She didn't answer right away, her gaze fixed on the floor as if she was searching for some hidden solution in the cracks of the tiles. Finally, she looked up at me, her eyes filled with something I couldn't quite place, regret, maybe, or guilt, or something else entirely. "I don't know," she said quietly. "I just don't know." Silence fell over the room, thick and suffocating. We stood there, staring at each other, two people who had once shared everything but now felt like strangers. I wanted to scream, to cry, to lash out and make her feel the same pain she'd inflicted on me. But all I could do was stand there, feeling the weight of everything crashing down around me. Why him? I finally asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Why did you choose him? Rebecca sighed, running a hand through her hair. It wasn't about him, she said, her tone flat and emotionless. It could have been anyone, honestly. I was looking for something, anything, to make me feel alive again. To make me feel like I mattered. And I didn't matter to you? I asked, the hurt evident in my voice. She shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes. Of course, you did. But somewhere along the way, we lost each other. I lost myself. And instead of trying to find my way back, I took the easy way out. I didn't know what to say to that. Part of me wanted to scream at her, to tell her how pathetic that excuse was, how it didn't justify what she'd done. But another part of me, a small part buried deep inside, understood. We'd both lost something in this marriage, something that neither of us had been able to hold on to. But that didn't mean I could forgive her. Not yet, maybe not ever. I don't know what to do, I admitted, the words feeling heavy on my tongue. I don't know how to move forward from this. Rebecca wiped at her eyes, her shoulders slumping in defeat. Neither do I. We stood there in silence, the weight of our shattered lives pressing down on us. There were no more accusations, no more screaming. Just the cold, hard reality that our marriage, our life together, had been irreparably damaged. But there was one thing I knew for sure, whatever came next, it wouldn't be easy. We were standing at the edge of a precipice, and there was no going back. Only forward, into the unknown. The days that followed our confrontation were a blur of tension, anger, and a silence so thick it was suffocating. Rebecca and I barely spoke, each of us retreating into our own corners of the house, trying to navigate the mess we'd found ourselves in. She kept to herself, often leaving the house for hours without saying where she was going or when she'd be back. I stopped asking. I didn't care anymore. But inside, I was boiling. Every time I looked at her, all I could see was that kiss, that smug look on her lover's face, and the sound of her voice as she tried to blame me for her betrayal. It gnawed at me, this burning need for some kind of retribution. She had torn apart the life we built together, and I wasn't just going to sit back. So, I started planning. I knew that if I was going to get any sense of justice, it had to be something she'd feel deep down, something that would cut her as deeply as she'd cut me. And then it came to me, something simple, but devastating. If Rebecca thought she could carry on with her life like nothing had happened, I'd show her just how wrong she was. First, I gathered all the evidence I had collected, photos, texts, everything. I didn't intend to use it in court or to demand a divorce, but rather as a tool to humiliate her, to expose her for the lying, cheating bitch she'd become. But that was only the beginning. I had something far more personal in mind. I began paying close attention to her schedule, especially when she wasn't home. She still went out often, though I had no idea where she was going or who she was with. It didn't matter. What mattered was when she wasn't around. I started small, making subtle changes she wouldn't notice right away. I canceled her subscription to her favorite magazine and replaced it with one I knew she hated. I logged into her streaming accounts and deleted her saved shows, replacing them with content she despised. Little things, meant to unsettle her, to make her life just a little less comfortable. But that wasn't enough. I needed to go further, to hit her where it really hurt. Rebecca had always been proud of her appearance, and she took great care in maintaining it. So, I decided to strike at the one thing she valued most, her looks. I replaced her expensive skincare products with cheaper, inferior ones that looked almost identical. It took some effort, but I managed to find replicas that would gradually dry out her skin, causing breakouts and irritation. I swapped out her shampoos and conditioners for harsh, drying alternatives that would leave her hair dull and lifeless. It was all so calculated, so methodical. I felt a sick sense of satisfaction as I watched her go about her day, completely unaware of what I'd done. I knew it would take time for the effects to show, but that was part of the plan. I wanted it to be slow, insidious, something she wouldn't be able to trace back to me. And then I took it one step further. Rebecca was always meticulous about her wardrobe, spending hours picking out the perfect outfit, ensuring she looked her best for every occasion. I began to sabotage her clothes, small things at first, like loosening buttons or snagging zippers, but then more noticeable actions. I'd pour just a little bit of bleach into her dark clothes, enough to create subtle, ugly streaks that she wouldn't notice until it was too late. I ruined her favorite pair of heels by weakening the straps, making them break when she least expected it. Each time something went wrong for her, she'd get that look of frustration and confusion, and I'd have to fight to keep the smirk off my face. She had no idea I was behind it all, and that made it even sweeter. But there was one final piece to my plan, something that would truly drive home the point that she couldn't just walk all over me and get away with it. Rebecca had this ritual she followed every night. She'd run herself a bath, light some candles, and relax with a glass of wine. It was her way of unwinding, of washing away the day. I'd always respected that space, never intruding, but now I saw it as the perfect opportunity to make her life a living hell. One night, after she had gone out for one of her mysterious outings, I filled the bath with cold water instead of warm, setting the thermostat to ensure it wouldn't heat up. I replaced her favorite bath salts with something that would sting her skin, leaving it red and irritated. I even spiked her wine with a laxative, knowing that the discomfort would ruin her evening and force her to spend the night in the bathroom. When she finally returned, I watched from the shadows as she went through her routine. She stripped down and dipped her toes into the bath, only to recoil in shock as the icy water met her skin. The look of confusion and anger on her face was priceless, and I had to stifle a laugh as she cursed under her breath. But that was nothing compared to the scene that followed. She poured herself a glass of wine, took a long sip, and settled into the cold bath, trying to make the best of it. But within minutes, she was doubling over in pain, clutching her stomach as the laxative took effect. I watched her stumble out of the tub, water sloshing onto the floor as she scrambled to the bathroom, cursing and groaning in discomfort. I could hear her from the hallway, the sounds of her agony echoing off the walls. It was music to my ears. The next morning, she was a mess, her skin red and blotchy from the bath salts, her hair greasy and tangled from the bad shampoo, and dark circles under her eyes from a sleepless night. She was irritable, snapping at me for no reason, but I just smiled and pretended to be concerned, offering her the sympathy she didn't deserve. "Are you feeling okay?" I asked, keeping my voice calm and gentle, like I had nothing but her well-being in mind. "You look a little off." She glared at me, clearly in no mood for conversation. "I'm fine," she snapped, brushing past me on her way out the door. I watched her leave, my satisfaction growing with every step she took. She had no idea what was happening, no clue that I was behind every little inconvenience, every minor disaster in her life. And that was exactly how I wanted it. She was going to pay for what she did to me, and I wasn't going to let her off easy. This was just the beginning. The satisfaction I got from tormenting Rebecca with my little acts of sabotage was immense, but it wasn't enough. The rage I felt every time I thought about her betrayal burned too hot to be quenched by just watching her suffer in silence. I needed to make her pay in a way that would hit her where it really hurt, her reputation, her pride. And I needed to take down that smug asshole who thought he could just waltz into my life and steal what was mine. I'd thought long and hard about how to make the most of the photo I'd taken at the bar. It was a perfect shot, Rebecca kissing her lover, their bodies close, their hands wandering in a way that left no room for doubt about what was going on between them. That photo was my weapon, and I intended to use it to its fullest potential. Rebecca's parents had always been proud of their daughter. They saw her as this perfect, accomplished woman who could do no wrong. They were old-fashioned, the kind of people who believed in the sanctity of marriage, who would be horrified to find out their precious daughter was cheating on her husband. I knew that leaking the photo to them would devastate them, and by extension, Rebecca. I waited for the right moment, biding my time as I gathered more dirt on her lover. He worked at the same company as Rebecca, which meant he was practically asking for it. I knew where to strike, and it was just a matter of time before I could take him down. But first, I needed to expose the affair in a way that would cause maximum damage. One evening, while Rebecca was out, no doubt meeting with him again, I decided it was time to set my plan in motion. I printed the photo, slipped it into an envelope, and wrote a brief, anonymous note. Thought you should know what your daughter has been up to. I made sure the handwriting was unrecognizable and included a fake return address. Then I drove to the post office and dropped it in the mail. I knew it would arrive within a day or two, and I could only imagine the shock and horror that would spread through Rebecca's family when they saw the truth laid bare. But that was only the first part of my plan. Destroying Rebecca's image in her parents' eyes was satisfying, but it wasn't enough. I wanted to ruin her lover's life too, to make him regret ever coming near my wife. I knew where he worked, same place as Rebecca. He was some middle management type, climbing the corporate ladder with the same smug arrogance he displayed in that bar. I spent a few days gathering intel, following him after work, watching his interactions, noting down his habits. It was all so methodical, so calculated. I wanted to know everything about him before I struck. One night, I managed to break into his car. It was surprisingly easy. He had left it parked on a quiet street, and with a bit of practice, I'd become pretty good at this sort of thing. I found his work laptop in the back seat, along with some documents that looked important. I copied everything onto a flash drive, making sure to leave no trace of my presence. I took my time, going through every file, every email, looking for anything I could use against him. And I found it. Turns out, he had been skimming money off some of the projects he managed, fudging the numbers to make his team look better while pocketing a tidy sum for himself. It wasn't blatant, but it was enough to get him fired if the right people found out. And I was more than happy to make sure they did. The next day, I created an anonymous email account and sent the incriminating evidence to his boss, copying HR and the company's legal department. I made sure to include details that would make it clear this wasn't just a misunderstanding. By the time I was done, I knew there was no way he'd be able to talk his way out of it. But I didn't stop there. I knew that once the scandal broke, it would spread quickly through the office. Gossip always does. I wanted to make sure that when people talked about him, they'd mention Rebecca too. I leaked the photo to a few coworkers, making it look like it had been sent from an anonymous tipster. Within hours, the entire office was buzzing with the news: Rebecca and her lover, caught in the act, and now the guy was under investigation for embezzlement. The fallout was glorious. Rebecca came home that evening in a state of shock, her face pale and drawn. She didn't say much, just mumbled something about needing to be alone and locked herself in the bedroom. I could hear her on the phone, her voice trembling as she spoke to her parents, trying to explain, trying to justify what she'd done. But from the snippets I caught, it was clear they weren't having any of it. They were devastated, disappointed, and angry. And they weren't going to forgive her easily. Meanwhile, her lover's life was crumbling around him. He was suspended from work pending an investigation, and I knew it was only a matter of time before he was fired. His reputation was in tatters, his career in ruins. The office buzzed with the scandal, and both he and Rebecca became the subject of whispered conversations and knowing glances. They were the office joke, the cautionary tale, the scandal of the year. Rebecca tried to keep it together, but I could see the cracks forming. She'd always been so composed, so confident, but now she was falling apart. She barely spoke to me, and when she did, it was with a dull, defeated tone that made it clear she knew she was cornered. She knew I was behind it, but she couldn't prove it. She was too afraid to confront me directly, too afraid of what else I might do. And that was exactly how I wanted it. Watching her crumble under the weight of her own actions, seeing the man she'd thrown everything away for have his life destroyed, gave me a twisted sense of satisfaction. They both deserved every bit of it. I didn't need to hit her or scream at her, I'd done something far worse. I'd taken away her sense of security, her pride, and her reputation. I'd made sure that every time she looked in the mirror, she'd see the reflection of a woman who had lost everything because of her own selfishness. But this wasn't the end. No, this was just the beginning. I wasn't done with them yet. Not by a long shot. The days following the scandal were a whirlwind of consequences, and each one was more devastating than the last. Rebecca's world, which she had so carefully curated, was crumbling right before her eyes. I watched it all unfold with a cold satisfaction, knowing that this was exactly what she deserved. Her parents, once so proud of their daughter, were absolutely livid. They couldn't believe that their Rebecca, their perfect little girl, had done something so vile. When the photo of her kissing her lover reached them, it was as if a bomb had gone off in their lives. They called her immediately, demanding explanations, but no excuse she gave could soothe their anger. They were traditional, and cheating was the ultimate sin in their eyes, an unforgivable act that brought shame not only to her but to the entire family. It didn't take long for them to make their decision. They disowned her. Just like that, Rebecca found herself without the support of the people who had always been there for her. They told her in no uncertain terms that she was no longer their daughter, that she had betrayed the family and that there was no coming back from that. She was cut off, emotionally and financially. The funds they had provided for her, the safety net she'd always relied on, were gone. When she told me about it, her voice was a mixture of disbelief and despair. We were sitting in the living room, the tension between us so thick it was almost suffocating. I could see the tears welling up in her eyes, but I felt nothing, no sympathy, no pity. This was her mess, and she had to live with it. They disowned me, James, she said quietly, her voice trembling. They said I've brought shame to the family and that they don't want anything to do with me anymore. I nodded, keeping my expression neutral. Sounds about right. Her eyes flashed with anger at my response, but it quickly faded into resignation. She knew she couldn't expect comfort from me. Not anymore. What are we going to do? She asked, her voice small, almost childlike. There it was, the question I'd been waiting for. What are we going to do? As if there was still a we, as if there was any chance of fixing what she'd broken. But I had already made up my mind. I knew exactly what I needed to do to finally free myself from this nightmare. I've already spoken to a lawyer, I said, watching her closely for her reaction. I'm filing for divorce. For a moment, she just stared at me, as if she couldn't quite process what I'd said. Then the realization hit her, and she gasped, covering her mouth with her hands as tears began to spill down her cheeks. Divorce, she whispered, her voice breaking. James, please, don't do this. We can work through this. I made a mistake, a terrible mistake, but we can fix it. Please, don't leave me. Her pleas were desperate, pitiful even, but I felt no urge to relent. You destroyed our marriage, Rebecca. There's nothing left to fix. She shook her head, sobbing openly now. I know I messed up. I know I hurt you, but we've been together for 15 years. Doesn't that mean anything to you? We can go to counseling, we can try to make it work. Please, just give me a chance to make things right. I let out a bitter laugh. Make things right? How do you plan on doing that, Rebecca? You think a few therapy sessions are going to erase what you did? You cheated on me, you lied to me, and you threw away everything we had for what? A fling? There's no coming back from that. But I love you, she cried, reaching out to grab my hands, but I pulled away. I was stupid and selfish, but I love you, James. Please don't do this. I stood up, putting distance between us. I couldn't stand the sight of her anymore, the sight of the woman who had betrayed me and expected me to just forgive and forget. If you loved me, you wouldn't have done what you did. You wouldn't have destroyed our marriage for some cheap thrill. I can't live with that, Rebecca. I won't. She stood up too, her face a mess of tears and desperation. James, I'm begging you. I've lost everything, my parents, my reputation, everything. Don't take away my last chance. Please, I'm begging you. I turned away, unable to look at her any longer. I had made my decision, and there was no turning back. It's over, Rebecca. I'm filing for divorce, and you're going to sign the papers. This marriage is dead." Her sobs filled the room as I walked out, leaving her standing there alone. I headed upstairs to the bedroom, my mind already focused on the next steps. The divorce would be swift and brutal, no mercy, no compromise. I wanted out, and I wanted out as quickly as possible. The next day, I went to the lawyer's office to finalize the paperwork. It was all so clinical, so impersonal, and that suited me just fine. There was no room for emotion in this process, no space for second thoughts. I wanted a clean break, a chance to rebuild my life without the stain of betrayal hanging over me. When I got back home, Rebecca was sitting in the kitchen, staring blankly at the table. She looked like a ghost of the woman she once was, pale, lifeless, defeated. I handed her the papers without a word, watching as she took them with trembling hands. "Sign them," I said flatly. "It's better for both of us." She looked up at me, her eyes pleading, but I refused to soften. "James, please. Can't we at least talk about this? Please don't do this to us." "There is no us, Rebecca," I replied coldly. "Not anymore." She swallowed hard, her hands shaking as she picked up a pen. For a moment, I thought she might refuse, might try to fight it. But then she lowered her head and signed her name, her tears smudging the ink on the page. "Good," I said, taking the papers back from her. "I'll file these tomorrow. I suggest you start thinking about where you're going to live once this is over." Her head snapped up at that, panic flooding her eyes. "What do you mean? This is our home. Where am I supposed to go?" "That's not my problem," I replied, my voice hard. "You'll get a settlement, but I'm keeping the house. You can figure out the rest on your own." She started to cry again, but I didn't care. I turned and walked away, feeling nothing but a cold, hollow satisfaction. This was what she deserved. She had made her bed, and now she would lie in it, alone, without her family, without her lover, and soon, without her husband. As I headed upstairs, I felt a strange sense of calm settle over me. The anger, the pain, the need for revenge, it was all fading now, replaced by a quiet acceptance. I had done what I needed to do. I had destroyed the life of the woman who had destroyed mine, and now I could finally move on. The next few days were a blur of paperwork and legal meetings, but eventually, it was done. The divorce was filed, and all that was left was for it to go through the courts. Rebecca had become a shell of her former self, barely speaking, barely eating. She was a wreck, and while part of me felt a twisted sense of triumph, another part of me felt nothing. I had gotten my revenge. I had destroyed her life. But as I sat in the silence of our now empty house, I realized that the person I had once been was gone too. The man who had loved Rebecca, who had built a life with her, who had trusted her, he was dead, buried under the weight of betrayal and revenge. What remained was something else, something colder, harder. But maybe that was for the best. Maybe that was the only way to survive in a world where love could turn to ashes in the blink of an eye. As I looked out the window, watching the sun set on what had once been our life together, I knew that this was the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. A chapter where I would rebuild, where I would find a way to live again, alone, but free from the chains of a broken marriage. And as the darkness fell, I felt a strange, bitter peace. The days turned into weeks, and the finality of it all began to sink in. The divorce was filed, the papers were signed, and there was nothing left to do but wait for the court to make it official. Rebecca had retreated into herself, barely leaving the house, barely speaking. The vibrant, confident woman she once was had been replaced by someone I hardly recognized, a shell, a shadow of her former self. It was almost pathetic to watch, but I couldn't bring myself to care. This was the bed she had made, and now she was lying in it. Alone. The house was eerily quiet now, devoid of the arguments, the tension, the life that had once filled its walls. It was like living in a tomb, and in a way, that was fitting. The life we'd built together was dead, and this house was just a monument to its failure. Rebecca stayed in the guest room now. The bedroom we had once shared was just another reminder of what we'd lost, so she'd moved out of it, taking refuge in a smaller, less significant part of the house. I didn't ask her what she planned to do next or where she would go once the divorce was finalized. It wasn't my concern anymore. As far as I was concerned, the sooner she was out of my life, the better. One evening, about a week after she signed the papers, I found her sitting in the living room, staring blankly at the television. The sound was off, and the screen was just showing some mindless infomercial, but she wasn't really watching. She was just there. Lost. I considered walking past her, ignoring her like I had been doing for weeks, but something made me stop. Maybe it was the finality of it all, or maybe it was the fact that, despite everything, there were still things that needed to be said before we went our separate ways. I wasn't sure what compelled me, but I walked over and sat down across from her. She didn't look up, didn't acknowledge my presence. She just kept staring at the TV, her eyes glazed over with exhaustion and grief. I cleared my throat, the sound startling in the silence of the room. "We need to talk," I said, keeping my voice calm and even. She blinked, slowly turning her head to look at me. There was no anger in her eyes anymore, no defiance. Just a deep, bone-weary sadness. "What's there left to talk about?" she asked, her voice hoarse from lack of use. "Where do you plan on going after the divorce is finalized?" I asked, ignoring her question. It was practical, cold, but it was something we needed to address. She shrugged, looking away again. "I don't know. I haven't thought that far ahead." I sighed, rubbing a hand over my face. "You can't stay here, Rebecca. Once the divorce goes through, you need to find somewhere else to live." "I know," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I don't know where to go. My parents won't speak to me. I've lost my job, my reputation. Everything's gone." I felt a flicker of something in my chest, pity, maybe, or regret, but I quickly squashed it. She had done this to herself. This was her mess to clean up, not mine. "You'll get a settlement," I said, keeping my tone businesslike. "It won't be much, but it'll be enough to get you started somewhere new." She nodded slowly, as if the words barely registered. "Okay." We sat in silence for a long time after that, the weight of everything that had happened hanging heavy in the air. There was so much I wanted to say, so many things I wanted to ask, but I knew it wouldn't change anything. The damage was done, and no amount of talking could undo it. Finally, Rebecca spoke again, her voice trembling. "Do you think you'll ever forgive me?" The question caught me off guard, and I didn't answer right away. I'd spent so long being angry, so long plotting my revenge, that I hadn't really considered the idea of forgiveness. It seemed impossible, almost absurd, after everything she'd done. But as I sat there, looking at the broken woman in front of me, I realized that holding on to that anger forever would only poison me further. It would keep me trapped in the past, chained to a life that no longer existed. "I don't know," I said honestly. "Maybe, one day. But not now. Not anytime soon." She nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks, but she didn't try to wipe them away. "I understand." More silence followed, thick and oppressive. I knew this was it, the last real conversation we'd ever have. There was no going back, no fixing what was broken. We were two people who had shared a life, who had loved and hurt each other in equal measure, but now that life was over. "Where did it all go wrong?" she asked quietly, more to herself than to me. I didn't have an answer for her. Maybe it had started to go wrong the moment we stopped communicating, the moment we let the distance grow between us. Maybe it had always been wrong, and we'd just been too blind to see it. Or maybe it didn't matter anymore. The reasons, the blame, the endless what-ifs, they were all irrelevant now. What mattered was that it was over, and we had to live with that. "I don't know," I replied finally. "But I think it's time we both moved on." She looked at me, really looked at me, for the first time in what felt like forever. There was a sadness in her eyes, a deep regret that I knew she would carry with her for the rest of her life. And maybe, just maybe, that was punishment enough. "You're right," she said softly. "I'll start looking for a place tomorrow." I nodded, standing up from the couch. "Good." As I walked away, I heard her take a shaky breath, trying to hold back another wave of tears. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I knew that if I did, I might feel something, pity, sadness, maybe even a tiny bit of compassion, but I couldn't afford that. Not now. I went to bed that night feeling strangely numb. The satisfaction I'd felt from my revenge had faded, replaced by an emptiness I couldn't quite describe. I had destroyed Rebecca's life, just as she had destroyed mine, but the victory was hollow. There was no joy in it, no real closure. Just the knowledge that it was over, and that we were both broken in different ways. The next morning, Rebecca was gone. She left a note on the kitchen counter, nothing more than a brief goodbye and a promise to send for the rest of her things once she found a place to stay. I crumpled the note and tossed it in the trash, not wanting any more reminders of the life we'd once shared. The divorce went through without any issues, finalized a few weeks later. Rebecca didn't contest it, didn't try to drag it out. She signed the final papers without a word, and just like that, our marriage was officially over. The house was mine, the life we'd built together reduced to ashes. But as I stood in the empty house, surrounded by the remnants of our time together, I realized that the end of our marriage wasn't just the end of a relationship, it was the end of who I used to be. The man I'd been when I married Rebecca, the man who had loved her and built a life with her, was gone. I was someone else now, someone harder, colder. Someone who had seen the worst side of love and come out the other side scarred and changed. I didn't know what the future held for me, but I knew that whatever it was, I would face it alone. And maybe that was for the best. Because the truth was, I didn't know how to trust anymore. I didn't know how to love. All I knew was how to survive. As I locked the door behind me, leaving the house that had once been our home, I felt a strange sense of peace. Not happiness, not closure, just peace. The storm had passed, and now, all that was left was to rebuild. But this time, I would build something just for me. Something no one could take away. Something that wouldn't shatter at the first sign of trouble. I would rebuild myself, piece by piece, stronger and wiser than before. And in the end, that was all I could do.